I'm Heidi Pigott Irwin. Around 50 years ago, the Parma Wallaby was thought to be extinct in Australia, and my father, Peter Pigott, whose first passion has always been wildlife, was determined to find out more. This short film reveals what the power of one can do to help save a species.
Rightio, well, we're going to start with sweet potatoes and then we change to carrots. Each day we process 15 kilos of carrots and about 30 kilos of sweet potatoes when we have them. We don't have them every day. We take 2 loads down. 10 kilos of carrots in one area, plus sweet potatoes, and 5 kilos in another area. We might see up to 100 or maybe up to 200 wallabies tonight, hopefully. The whole fence is electrified with 4 wires that carry 8,000 volts, which keeps feral animals out, particularly foxes. The Parma Wallaby was considered to be extinct for more than 80 years. About 55 years ago, Anne and I went to Africa, and I came home very concerned about the loss of species in Africa. When I came home, I had been appointed chairman of their projects committee, and I talked to Dr. Don McMichael, who was the director of national parks, about my concern. And he looked at me and he said, "Peter, don't worry about what's going on in Africa. Australia has the worst history for the loss of species on the entire planet." That shocked me to hear that. So I said, "Well, what can I do?" And he said, "In time you'll find something to do." I read at the same time about Professor David Ride had rediscovered the Parma Wallaby, and I thought, oh my God, what's this? I hadn't met Professor Ride at that stage, but I was terribly interested in his story. He was writing a scientific article on the extinction of the Parma Wallaby, and he went to the Australian Museum in Sydney and went through their collection of skins. None were marked Parma Wallaby, so he had no idea what they looked like for his scientific paper. He discovered that they had specimens in the Amsterdam Museum, in the Paris Museum for Natural History, and in the London Museum for Natural History. So he got on a plane, he went over there and he went through their collections. And as he went through one of the collections in the British Museum, he thought, I've seen this skin before, because he had gone through the skins in the Natural History Museum in Sydney, but none were marked Parma Wallaby. He then thought, maybe it's been marked incorrectly. So when he looked at where the skin that had been collected, when he got back to Sydney, and went through their museum and said, this is a Parma Wallaby, it's not the striped wallaby which was marked. He looked at where it was collected, and it was collected in 1902 on Koalas Island in New Zealand, and he thought, how can that possibly be? Why would we have Parma Wallabies or other animals from Australia in New Zealand? And so he did a bit more research and discovered that Sir George Grey, who had been the governor of South Australia, had been made the governor of New Zealand. He was an animal lover, and he actually had a wallaby named after him, the Toulash wallaby, or Wallaby Grey, after Sir George Grey. And he bought Koalas Island when he went there as governor, and took with him a number of Australian animals which was never recorded. As a matter of fact, he actually took some African animals over there, not carnivores, but animals that were just suitable to have on Koalas Island. So he thought, well, I wonder whether these animals are still alive on Koalas Island. So he asked two naturalists, Dr. Wadzicki and Dr. Flux, to go over there to the island and trap. And they went over there 3 times actually altogether, and they came back after the first three weeks and said, no, we can't find the Parma Wallaby. Ryde implored them, please go back, I'll get funding for you to go back to the island, and he received a telegram from them at the beginning of the 3rd week which said, David, we're very happy to tell you that the Parma Wallaby is extant, not extinct. That telegram went down in history, in natural history, as one of the most important telegrams ever sent. And so, knowing that, he published his paper. It was very well received, and everyone was very happy that the animal still existed on Koalas Island. When I went over and especially met David Ryde and asked him about it, I said, David, what are you going to do about it? And he said, well, I'm not sure. I mean, it's a marvellous thing that it's extant. And I said, look, we have to bring it back to Australia. And he said, where would you put it? And I said, well, I'm going to buy more land at Mount Wilson, next to my property at Mount Wilson. I'll build the fences to keep out foxes, we'll electrify the fences, and we'll see whether it'll be Australia's first attempt at saving an endangered species. He said, Peter, that would be incredible. When the word got out I was going to do this, the zoo phoned me, National Parks and Wildlife Service said, Pete, it's a great idea, but can you get some wallabies for us? And Macquarie University, who were doing scientific work on the animal, said, we'd like some too, so I arranged to ship to Mount Wilson, to ship to Pulborough Island for national parks, to ship to Taronga Zoo in Sydney and Macquarie University. Now, this is not an easy task. It sounds fine to be able to go and pick an animal up from another country and bring it over to Australia, but it isn't easy. And the proof of that is that Pulborough Island, National Parks, wallabies, Macquarie University wallabies and Taronga Zoo wallabies all died. The only ones that survived were the ones here at Mount Wilson, and they've been here now for 52 years, and it is the largest colony in the world, and in a moment we'll show you the wallabies. First food drop, we have 2 places where we drop the food, and we spread it out so you'll see the animals in a long line. They know that I'm here, they're watching us from behind the bushes, and that's part of the habitat that they really feel comfortable and safe in, where they're not seen by anything. But they'll come out now that we know that they've been fed regularly at about this time. It's about 30 or 40 minutes before dusk. So we'll just spread this out. And these dishes are for the special pellets that we give the animals. It was first described by Gould. You might remember Gould in your school days, the bird man from England, came out to Australia in about 1830, And he wrote a book about Australian wildlife, included in the book was the first description of the Parma Wallaby. He called it the white-throated wallaby, and when they stand up you can see that they've got a white throat. They were called the Parma Wallaby by the Australian Aborigines, and that is the name that the scientists always use. In respect to the Aboriginal population of Australia, they're called the Parma Wallaby. Gould called them the white-throated wallaby. You might be curious to know how many babies that they have in 1 year. They only have one. And it's very interesting because the gestation period is only 30 to 32 days. It's born, it crawls up into the pouch and remains in the pouch for 32 to 34 weeks. As it gets older, of course, it comes out of the pouch and then goes back into the warmth of the pouch. So their life cycle, we've discovered that they can live up to 20 years here. Probably in the wild, maybe 10 to 12 years, because there's a lot of stress in the wild, whereas there's no stress in a place like this. In the wintertime they're fed every day, they're looked after really well. Shortly, when we go to the second feeding spot, we'll come back and there could be, with a bit of luck, 50 animals, maybe even 100 here eating. So this is, as I said a little earlier, the largest colony of Parma wallabies on the planet. And we're looking forward to being able to have them in other areas in Australia. While there are foxes, they can never be released in the wild. In 1988, which was the bicentennial year for Australia, 200 years of European occupation, we released 48 animals back into the area that Gould described was their habitat, which was the Illawarra escarpment near the little town of Robinson. And we released them in the waterboard area, 48 animals. It was the largest release of an endangered animal in Australia's history. Dick Smith, a very well-known Australian, very generously gave us 12 radio collars so we could track what they were doing. The Deputy Director of National Parks at the time was Dr. Jack Giles. He and I camped on the site to make certain what was happening to the animals. We flew them down in 2 helicopters to the release site, and the greatest tragedy probably in the history of wildlife in Australia, all 48 animals were killed within 3 weeks by foxes. So we'll go up to the second site. This is the second feeding place, and you'll see a fence here that doesn't keep the animals in at all. What it does, it prevents eagles chasing the animals from out here. They go straight under the fence and the eagles can't hunt in a forest. So it doesn't keep the animals out or in, it just keeps them from being protected from eagle predation. So we'll drop a few carrots and throw it over here. This is where they, every night, you see them sitting there waiting. I had this made. It holds 1 ton of pellets. Easy to access. Just put it under there. Open that tap. And I'll just show you the pellets. These are the pellets. They're 14% protein for the animals, and they love them. This is mainly for when it's raining, because the pellets are ruined by water. So we built this so we can put them in here, but the ducks will also come up and eat them. This is the first attempt at saving an endangered species in Australia. Now, since I started this over 52 years ago, there have been some very, very good organisations evolved to do the same thing in a much, much bigger way. The Australian Conservation Foundation have millions of hectares of land set aside in the northern Australia where land is very cheap, and they've done a fantastic job in saving many species. UNESCO announced earlier this year, 2021, that the planet will lose 1 million species over the next 50 years. So what we've done here is very small. One species. I have been involved in others. The CSIRO, the Australian Museum in Sydney, came to me many years ago and said, Pete, the Lord Howe Island wood hen, a flightless bird, first described by Captain Cook when he sailed through and stopped at the island, is in danger of disappearing completely. It's down to 25 birds. And they asked me whether I was interested in helping save the wood hen. I said, of course I am. So I won't go into all the details, but we went over to the island. We captured 12 of the birds. We built a special enclosure for them on the island, and it's been, the UNESCO have recognised it as one of the best attempts and successful attempts at saving a bird species on the planet. You now go to Lord Howe Island and you'll trip over them. They have other problems there with rats, which came to the island in 1922 when the SS Macambo floundered off the reef and Rattus swam ashore. Many of the birds, there were 14 species of birds on the island. 9 of them are now extinct, and the flightless birds were imperiled by the fact that the rats would come and eat their eggs on their nests on the ground. When you alter a pristine environment, you have problems, and that's now well recognised. It wasn't recognised 200 years ago or 100 years ago. So then we also were involved with the first colony of yellow-footed rock wallaby was discovered out near Mootwingie in New South Wales, the first colony in New South Wales, that is. The yellow-footed rock wallaby does quite well in the Flinders Ranges and can be found at a property called Arkaroola. What I did was I went out there and I organised to buy a whole mountain range where the wallaby was, and we got the army to come in and shoot goats. They shot 6,000 goats, and that's another animal that we've been involved in. But the people who have done most of all is the Australian Wildlife Conservation Foundation. But they also have 25 million a year. That's a big help if you're trying to save a species. We had no help until recently. After the bushfires in New South Wales, people came out of the woodwork to help wildlife, and we were discovered, and it was an enormous thrill for us that young people showed such interest in looking after our wildlife. There's an organisation called Save Australian Wildlife, organised by very young people, and they've been an enormous help to us, supplying lots of enthusiasm and lots of food for the animals. So it's not all doom and gloom. We're very fortunate to have great support that we never got from the government. Well, you can't believe this. The government always talks about how important it is to look after our wildlife, but when you say to them, hey, wait a minute, well, what about the Local Government Act, having that changed so that we can have rate free. I mean, I pay $8,000 a year rates on my whole property. On the wildlife reserve, over $4,000 a year. And when it comes to doing something really physical in helping the endangered species, they don't come to the party. They just say, "Oh, you're doing a great job, Pete, that's fantastic what you're doing, but we can't help you, sorry." So they collect all the rates, and we have to work hard. I must say that for 5 years I fought the Department of Finance in New South Wales, because we paid about, I think, $4,000 a year land tax on our second block of land, which is the wildlife reserve. And I said, that's grossly unfair. That should be taken away. And after 5 years they said, "Pete, you're right, we're abolishing that tax." And it's not just, they said, "We'll do it just for you." And I said, "No, you won't. It has to be for everyone or not at all." And so they said, that's absolutely correct. What we were proposing could be interpreted as being corrupt, and we're not corrupt. So we abolished that tax, which is fantastic, because that saved us $80 a week for doing something for the nation. I've often been asked about koalas, because they're very topical right at the moment, because they're believed to be on the brink of possible extinction. Koalas were at Mount Wilson right up to about 1926 in quite large numbers. In about 1926, 250,000 koala skins were exported to the United States of America for fur coats. And because of the depletion of such a huge number of koalas, they became subject to a disease called chlamydia. Chlamydia is an eye disease. It sends them blind, and eventually they die, of course, because they can't see what they're eating. So they really disappeared from Mount Wilson. In 1969-70, National Parks gave me about 8 koalas. I brought them up here. We had them here for several years. Then we let them go to try and re-establish koalas on Mount Wilson, Mount Irvine, and they have done incredibly well. We don't know how they fared in the last fire, but we re-established them here, which was really a marvellous achievement, I think, and we were delighted to do that. One of the other things that was very interesting, people worry about domestic cats. They are a huge problem for our wildlife, and particularly for bird life. In 1971, I employed a scientist, Anne Jelinek, her name was, to work out how many feral cats there were between Mount Victoria, Mount Wilson, Mount Irvine, and Mount Tomah. She worked on it for a year, trapping, and her results were quite extraordinary. She believed that in that area that I'm talking about, there were 25,000 feral cats. So you can understand a cat eats lizards, it eats frogs, it eats all kinds of wildlife, and some of the cats are so huge they'll kill a Parma Wallaby as well. So don't let your pussy cat go out into the forest and say, "He'll be okay, he'll survive." He will survive, you're quite right, but he'll also kill thousands and thousands of Australian animals.